Hello, this is Christiandealism, and today I'm going to be sort of reflecting on about me being a Catholic. So, as you all know, I became a Catholic, or at least I was confirmed. I was baptized, confirmed, and received Eucharist about a year ago. Not exactly a year ago, but it was about a year ago. So last Easter Vigil, and I know Easter Vigil is coming up, and so thought I would do a video kind of as a reflection of where I've been in my spiritual life. Because philosophy I think is important, definitely. But I've done a few things on this channel, at least recently, more spiritual side. So, because of that, I wanted to kind of reflect upon, where I've been. Um, and I'm going to be trying to be honest as I can. So, the first thing I want to mention when it comes to my conversion is that prior to me joining RCIA, I wasn't practicing the faith at all. Like, I didn't go to church. I didn't pray. Um, and I feel kind of bad during that time, but I just didn't have this spiritual life. Um, I treated Christianity as just this intellectual like game, basically, right? I didn't really take it as seriously as I should have, I would say. Um, and before I joined, of course, this was all before RCA. So of course, when I joined RCA, I went to church like every Sunday from that point forward, unless I was sick or something. But the important thing is like me becoming a Catholic has like definitely um, helped my spiritual life in a very significant way. I don't want to get into too much details because I have had a few quote unquote religious experiences. I don't know what people think about that. It's all personal, right? So I'm not gonna like tell a grand story about what I experienced because I'm not here to convince anyone that experience was real. But I've had spiritual experiences, way more as a Catholic than as a Protestant, and that even applies like no, because when I was a Protestant, at least in my younger years, I used to pray a lot and nothing would come up, right? Whereas a Catholic, it's less common for there to be a lack of religious experiences. Now, that's just from my personal experience, right? People can disagree with that. People might say, "Kyle, you're delusional" or something, right? Um, that's fine. That's your opinion, right? Um, but epistemically, at least for me, while I wouldn't use the experience that I've had to convince someone else that Catholicism is true, or that Christianity is true. What I will say is that it is, I would say, has had some level of epistemic weight towards my belief in Christianity and in Catholicism. Not to say that it's overwhelming, right? It may not be great evidence. It's not my primary reason for my belief in Catholicism or Christianity. Um, but it is, I would say it does have some kind of weight evidential weight. Not again, not great evidential weight, but it has some weight. All you need for evidence is that it increases the probability of your hypothesis. So if Christianity is true, then I would expect um, Christians that have religious experiences. And there are Christians that have religious experiences, and I myself have had some religious experiences. May not be great evidence, right? It's not an exact like quantity of, it's not like you can put a number to it or something. But it does increase the probability, and that's all. To me, that's what really all that really needs to count, right? So for that reason, um, I will say that being a Catholic has definitely helped in my spiritual life in ways that would have never been possible if I were still a Protestant. That's not because of like, I'm not trying to be biased against Protestants or anything like that, right? I'm not trying to downplay them, or I may disagree with them on a lot of things, but it doesn't mean that therefore, like, that I think that I don't think it's a defeater for Protestant theology because I think there are other considerations. But what I will say is that being a Catholic has probably been the best decision I've ever made in terms of my spiritual growth. In terms of my relationship with God, becoming Catholic, making that decision to become Catholic has been the best decision I've ever made in terms of my journey towards salvation, my journey towards heaven. People may disagree with that, and that's fine, right? Um, but that's what I feel now, looking back at my decision, um, and that was the best decision I could have ever made for myself moving forward in terms of my relationship with God. Again, if there's Protestants that don't like my conversion, that's fine. Um, but I think what matters more importantly is the spiritual life. So I don't care if you're Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox. I think we can all agree as Christians that the spiritual life is very important. And if a Christian goes from one denomination to another, and if that helps them in their spiritual growth, why wouldn't we support that? Why wouldn't we support that? Like, for example, if there was a Catholic that became an Orthodox or a Protestant, and if their spiritual life increased because of that decision, am I going to necessarily talk down on them? No. I mean, I may disagree with their decision because they didn't consider some argument, right? Or they didn't look at you know, the data in question that I think supports my tradition over theirs. But if their transition to that helps them in their spiritual life, I can't really argue against that, right? Um, I could try to argue that they made faulty reasoning or they were ill-informed or something, right? But at the end of the day, in terms of them increasing their closeness to God or whatever, like I'm not going to object to that aspect of their conversion to some other Christian tradition, right? The reason why I hold to my Christian tradition as a Catholic is because I think my tradition goes back to the apostles, right? Goes back to what Jesus himself established. But that doesn't mean that, just because there's some other tradition that came later and that people join that tradition, that therefore, you know, um, I should, talk down upon them. And that's kind of my main point here, which is that what I will say is that me being a Catholic has significantly increased my closeness to God. Again, that's all subjective, right? But I think it's important because really the spiritual life is kind of subjective in that sort of way. Now it's objective, has an objective stance, like you have this objective relationship with God, but it's also subjective in the sense that if you feel like you're closer to God, if you follow some tradition, right, or follow some spiritual practices, um, then that's all that really matters. Now, of course, I would say another aspect of that is having the right beliefs, right? So I'm not totally like putting it all on someone's subjective opinion on it, but I do think it has some kind of weight. And so for that reason, I just want to mention here that I think that a lot of people, when they hear Protestants become Catholics, they will just automatically assume that, oh well, can only converted because he felt like this spiritual experience or something. For me, it wasn't like that. I didn't have any spiritual experience not. I didn't really have it. Even like when I was going through RCA, for example, I didn't have any kind of spiritual experience. The only real spiritual experience I had was like after I got baptized. So after I received the sacraments, is when I started getting um, these religious experiences, as people call them. Um, and I've even more recently, so this past week, I've had a religious experience, a pretty strong one, in fact. Again, is it like definitive proof? No, it's not definitive proof that my belief system is true, but I do think it has some weight, right? That's the important thing, right? Um, because naturalism, I would say, doesn't predict that kind of thing occurring. So where does this lead me? Well, what I will say is that while I will still be doing a lot of philosophy on this channel, using, continuing my Swinburne series, I'm also going to be planning to do some videos on spiritual stuff. So, um, I did, a short video on my view of the atonement. I'm going to be maybe doing a formal video on that. I don't know when. I don't have this planned out, but just keep that in mind when it comes to this channel. That this channel is going to be mostly philosophy, so like 80% philosophy, but then there's also going to be like 20% um, spiritual stuff, whatever it might be, or like eventually I'm going to have Michael Jones on to discuss eschatology, so that's another thing we're going to go into. Um, so yeah, that's all I have to say in terms of my conversion. That I think becoming Catholic has been the best decision I've ever made for myself. And I think if you are a Protestant, or let's say you're just kind of like this, you don't know which tradition is true. Like you're Eastern, or like you can't decide between like Eastern Orthodoxy or Catholicism. Um, and you want to, look at, well, what's the icebreaker? Well, if you don't have any evidential consideration, so if you think the evidence is tied, then I would say you should go with, um, what do you think is true? Like, consider this. Okay, this is sort of like, this isn't like an exact argument for the papacy, but let's just consider this kind of argument. Um, the papacy allows one to um, objectively identify what the church is. What does that mean? Well, it allows you to objectively say, hey, this is the teaching authority. Okay. This is what defines whether you are a part or under the authority of some teaching authority or not. So the papal office um, is itself kind of an icebreaker, so to speak, or maybe like a tiebreaker in terms of like, okay, well, how do we determine, which set of bishops or whatever is like the actual church? Um, the papacy allows one to do that because as a Catholic, all you have to say is that, well, the teaching authority of the church. So, if you accept like apostolic succession or, all the other stuff, all you really have to do is say something like, well, how do I know that my traditions go back to the apostles, and that there is a line of succession that we can observe today? Well, I would say that the way to do that is the question we need to ask is, well, is your teaching authority, so is your line of bishops or whatever, are they in communion with the papal office? If they are, then they're a part of the church. If they're not, then they're not. That's how you figure it out. If you're an Orthodox, you can't do that because there is no papal office according to Orthodoxy, right? So you have this problem where you can't objectively identify what is the church, what is the magisterium. Like, there's no way to do that. Um, again, don't consider that as necessarily like a strong, super duper strong argument for the papacy. Just consider that as a consideration if you are thinking about converting. And now, if you're not, if you have some other objections, then it doesn't apply to you. But that's, to me, that was the breaking point. That was, to me, like the core, like, tiebreaker between Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism is just that kind of line of thought. So if you're considering converting, just consider that as a consideration if you're at that level. Again, if you're not, then it doesn't really matter what I say. but yeah. So with that in mind, I thank you guys for watching my channel, because I appreciate it. And have a nice Easter, everyone.